quick prerequisite to the video, that was not how you pronounce that word. YouTube decided yesterday that you guys didn't need to see my review of The Shadow Rising, so if you want to watch my review of The Shadow Rising, it'll be linked at the end of the video. It just got put in no one's sub feed. It's like my lowest viewed video since before I had like 5,000 subs compared to the time it's been out. So I'm a little frustrated, but you know, YouTube, they got a lot of data. They got a lot of stuff to deal with, so I understand that they're gonna have some issues every now and then. But yeah, the review of Shadow Rising is out. It'll be linked at the end of this video, or you can just go to my channel now and watch it. Mild frustration. I'm so tired. How's it going, everybody? Now I know what you're thinking. Daniel's going to advocate for huge,
epic, built worlds in the fantasy genre.
That's where you'd be wrong. I personally do have a bit of a liking for larger fantasy worlds, not grotesquely huge Malazan Book of the Fallen. Not that I'm saying it's bad, it's just, oh my god. But I do like a richer world that I can dive into and really kind of lose myself in learning about. But by no means am I about to advocate that every author go out and try and burn a bunch of energy in building this huge, grandiose world that does not serve a purpose to their story. Because what this will result in is a bunch of worlds where the passion wasn't really there, and that is the worst kind of fantasy world. You can tell it when you read it. Authors felt obligated to build something that really wasn't in their original objective. It wasn't where their heart was. They wanted to tell a certain story, but because they were intimidated by the genre, instead they put a ton of their effort into kind of just building this thing that doesn't serve a purpose to that story they wanted to tell. Now, there's nothing wrong with authors who enjoy and execute these massive, huge worlds. I'm a fan of that. Please do that. I love it if it serves a purpose to your story and it's necessary. There are two prime examples of what I'm talking about here, and I don't want to call it a book for the negatives, so I'll just have two positives that are at either end of the spectrum. Let's look at A Song of Ice and Fire versus Gentlemen Bastards. A Song of Ice and Fire, compared to your average fantasy story, has a rather large fantasy world, and it serves a purpose to the grandiose story that's happening. Peoples and cultures are meeting and clashing. There's a war of power throughout the land. It makes sense that this world be huge because it needs to. On the other end of that spectrum, you have Gentlemen Bastards, which pretty much takes place in one city, and that city is built well, but no one will ever say that it's a very big fantasy world. It's just a well-defined one within the constraints that are there. But I think everyone's in agreement that Gentlemen Bastards would have greatly suffered if the author turned around and spent chapters just building and defining this world that we know nothing about and learn nothing about. That's pointless. It's not necessary. Stop it. If we hear about some lands, if we hear about an element of your world, I want it to interact with the story in some direct or indirect or small or major way, and if it doesn't, then it just kind of feels like a tease. And a couple of teases are okay, some kind of mysterious features and elements, but having something that's just completely unexplained and is just there feels sometimes just unnecessary. Not all the time. There are some great little mystical elements in worlds that we don't ever fully engage with. Tom Bombadil is a good example. No one knows what the Tom Bombadil is, and that's the point. He's crazy, he's absurd, he's an unknown, and that's the purpose. It still has a purpose in its unknowingness. It adds to the lore of Lord of the Rings, where even before there were these great gods, that there was Tom Bombadil. And yes, he's a character, but there is no denying that Tom Bombadil is still a world element as well. There's also nothing wrong with minimalist fantasy worlds. Worlds that seem to be very similar to our own with just a couple things changed. Because that's the author's vision, and really that's the overall point of this video. No author should feel pressured to make a world they do not want to. It just should serve the purpose of the story they want. And if the story is about the world, great. Go as big as you want. I think Wheel of Time is a story that is largely about the world. And that's why Robert Jordan spent so much time and effort into crafting the cultures and all these different countries and its histories, because it's all leading up to this pinnacle moment for the world. But if we spent all that time in something that's kind of equivalent, like Lightbringer, I don't think anyone would care, because Lightbringer is much more about the here and now rather than the past. So contextualize what you're writing as well. That's very important. If what you're writing has stakes in the histories, please give us the readers some of the histories. But if it really doesn't, and you don't really care about the history of your world, don't. That's fine. Dresden Files is a wonderful example of that. There's vague mentions of the past and how these things have kind of come to form to be, and I'm still fairly early on in the series, so maybe a story at a later point will require more history. Up to where I am in Dresden Files, it's fairly, you don't really need to know about the past. You know there's these organizations, they've been around for a while. They're ancient, just deal with it. Let's deal with the now, because that's what the story is. It's the now. Now, there's an obvious comment to be made on what I'm saying. Well, what if they want to write this story, but they also want to build this huge world, but they're not necessarily related? And that results in what I'm going to call the Forgotten Realms effect. This is not a commentary on the whole of Forgotten Realms, it's a commentary on some Forgotten Realms stories. If you're not aware, Forgotten Realms is an absolutely humongous fantasy series that multiple authors have written into, and as a result, there's some very disjointed fantasy world elements that are completely unrelated, and unless you're diving into every single story, which you're not going to, not every world element's going to play a major role to anything most characters are doing. Obviously, this is a very extreme example because we've had multiple visions building this world, but it's still an example of what I'm talking about. It doesn't necessarily hurt the series as long as your story's well done, and okay, the author still put a lot of passion into what they're building, no problem. That works for me. I'm okay with that. It's always going to feel more tight and concise when the world building you're doing either directly affects how the world feels to the reader or the storyline. Random elements will feel like random elements. Forgotten Realms has this problem because there's just been whole disjointed, completely unrelated things. It's hard to find a connection between what happened here and what happened here when they were from different visions. They're just elements that, okay, it's realistic, I guess, because not everything in the real world plays with each other. Is this huge evil wizard that's trying to end the world gonna deal with this war that's about to end this world? No. Okay. See, it's just kind of odd. It's not as straightforward, which in some ways is more realistic. There are multiple things that could end the world, but in terms of narrative and storytelling, no, it's not as focused, obviously. And I'm not saying it's inherently bad, it's just my observation on it. It will feel less focused. In kind of conclusion, I've already done a little bit of a summary here. I just keep advocating for authors to write what makes sense for them, what they really want to, where their passion is, and try to wrap everything to connect to the story in some relevant way, or have your more random elements serve a purpose into crafting tone for the world, or really changing how readers engage, or really changing how readers feel comfortable or sit in that world. If it's just completely out of nowhere and random, it's just going to feel almost like a waste of time, unless it's a very cool element on its own. But even then, I think a lot of readers will be left wanting, like, why wasn't this activated in the story? Why didn't this play a role? Now, on a final note here, I'm going to hit on something that is often brought up in the fantasy world conversation. Can a fantasy world be too big? Obviously, this is completely subjective. Everyone can decide how big they want their fantasy world. In fact, everyone has every right and all the ground in the world to disagree with everything I say in these Dear Author videos. These are more just for you to get a better taste of what I'm tired of seeing in fantasy and what I want to see more of. But when it comes to can a fantasy world be too big, when it comes to your average reader, someone who just wants to enjoy a fantasy narrative, I think the answer is yes. Because I enjoy larger worlds, I enjoy complex worlds, but even I get bogged down every now and then in different fantasy series where it just becomes kind of difficult to keep track of everything that's happening. So on a spectrum from Dresden Files to A Song of Ice and Fire to Malazan, most people, in my opinion, are going to fall comfortably between Dresden Files and A Song of Ice and Fire. You're going to get some more really intense fantasy fans who really prefer that in between A Song of Ice and Fire and Malazan scale world building, but as an author, unless it is completely your objective to just build, then I would kind of avoid that. I wouldn't set out to do that unless you're one of the 1% of world building fans who just, that is their shiznits, and it's one of the main reasons why they love the fantasy genre. This is kind of the hardest Dear Authors video I've had to make because, in my opinion, it's the most subjective one. It's the one where tastes vary across the board. I know people who really don't want any time spent in world building. They're just kind of wanting to hit the ground running and no one else build anything. Just focus on these characters and whatever whatever's directly related to the character. That's all that matters. And there's people who want chapters upon chapters of histories and countries and world building and politics. And there's no wrong answer there. So I kind of just vomited my taste out there. That was a horrible expression. I'm sorry I said that. And I'm curious more just to see what the community response is. Where are you in the spectrum of Dresden to Malazan? Where do you fall? What in your mind is the perfect sized fantasy world for you? Because I'd like to have a look at that data. Anyway, guys, I hope you liked this video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. Have a good one, y'all. Peace.